Hi friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime, or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. Now today's video is going to be the third and final installment in our series on Shanda Sharer. In previous videos, we have gone over the victim as well as the perpetrators. We have gone over extensively the night of the murder. And today we are going to go over the arrests, the charges, the sentencing, and the aftermath of the case. Now, if you remember, our last video ended with Toni Lawrence going with her parents to the authorities to make a report about the night that she just experienced. And she did this the following day, the very next day on January 11th. When she did this, that made the Madison police believe that the burned body that they found could be linked to the missing 12-year-old girl in Jeffersonville, Indiana. That's where this story is going to pick up today, with Detective Howard Henry going to Shanda Sharer's home to pick up dental records so that way they could utilize that to confirm that the burned victim was indeed Shanda Sharer. They would also use the testimony from Toni Lawrence to arrest Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett in the early morning hours on January 12th for the murder of Shanda Sharer. The same day that Melinda and Lori would be arrested, Shanda's autopsy would also be completed. And that autopsy would show that Shanda had several lacerations across her entire body. She had ligature marks on her wrists and on her ankles. It also showed that she was alive when she was caught on fire, as there was soot in her upper airway, which would only be present if she actively breathed it in. It wouldn't passively go there. She had to actively be breathing for it to be in that spot. She also had severe head trauma from blunt force objects. And then finally, like I said, it would show that she had been sodomized, and pretty violently. She had several internal lacerations from that, and it was about 3 to 3.5 inches inside of her. And those lacerations were also indicative that it had occurred when she was alive. This same day, a preliminary hearing would be held in Madison where a single count of murder would be issued against both Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett. It was also decided on this day that they would be tried as adults. Now, at this point, only Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett had been arrested or charged. And it's not because police didn't suspect Toni Lawrence and Hope Rippy of being more involved. In fact, that's exactly what they thought. They thought that the involvement from Toni Lawrence and Hope Rippy were greater, and that Toni Lawrence was kind of blurring some lines of truth as far as what happened that night. But they didn't have any concrete evidence. Now, the prosecutor of the case, Guy Townsend, felt the same way. In fact, he had reached out to the lawyers that had been acquired by the Lawrence family and the Rippy family, and he offered them a deal. If Toni Lawrence and Hope Rippy accepted this deal, Townsend agreed to, one, only take them to juvenile court. They would not be tried as an adult. They would go to juvenile court. And if they accepted this deal, the maximum punishment that they would get, maximum, worst case scenario, would be, one, to be labeled as juvenile delinquents. Two, they would serve a maximum of 6 years in a juvenile all-girls reformatory school. But three, they would have no criminal record. Now, Townsend only offered this deal if the girls would take and pass a polygraph test, and if they would also cooperate in getting a conviction against Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett. And both girls denied this deal. They stayed away from authorities. They stayed away from talking to anybody, and they chose not to accept this kind of deal. Police would start to gather what evidence they were able to get against the girls, both physical as well as witness testimony. In fact, several witnesses came forward talking about how Melinda wanted Shanda dead and how Melinda had talked about wanting to kill Shanda. More witnesses came forward talking about how Lori had a fascination with blood and death and murder and had talked about wanting to catch someone on fire and burn them alive. Police would go to the gas station where the girls got the gas that they used to set Shanda on fire, and the clerk would confirm that it was 4 girls who came, but the clerk was not able to pick the girls out of a high school yearbook. They got the data from the receipt, and that made them suspect that Tony Lawrence was hiding something, because the timestamp on the receipt from where they purchased gas did not align with the time that Tony was giving them as far as when she says they went to the gas station. Forensic expert Curtis Wells would go over Lori's car with a fine-tooth comb, and he would gather some things that might not be anything, like cigarettes and lighters and trash and receipts. But he would also gather undeniable evidence of Shanda being in the car that night. Things like Shanda's hair in the trunk of the car, blood samples from the trunk of the car, fingerprint samples from the trunk of the car. And he would gather all of this evidence to file away on Shanda's case. During all of this, Lori Tackett would be evaluated for psychological issues, given the fact that she freely and openly admitted to having hallucinations and what she felt like were possessions. On January 21st, her psych evaluation would come back and it would indicate that she did not require medication and wasn't experiencing psychosis. They did indicate that she was likely depressed, delusional, potentially paranoid, and may have an alcohol abuse problem. The final report indicated that Lori was falsifying or exaggerating her symptoms to avoid a conviction with an insanity plea. Now, Guy Townsend also did end up filing charges against Hope Rippy and Tony Lawrence. After collecting evidence and speaking with countless witnesses, on March 16, 1992, the Jefferson County Juvenile Court would hold a probability cause hearing for Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippy. The charges for the girls would include murder, criminal confinement, criminal deviant conduct, aggravated battery, arson, intimidation, and battery by means of a deadly weapon. However, another trial was done that day, and this trial would determine that the 2 girls would be tried as adults. Also on this day, new charges would be filed against Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett. Originally, the only charge that was filed against the girls was the murder charge, but now they would have the additional charges that were also filed against Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippy. Lori Tackett and Melinda Loveless would get one more additional charge that Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippy did not get, and that was for child molestation. And the reason why Hope Rippy and Tony Lawrence didn't get this charge is because they were under the age where they would qualify for that, because they were essentially children themselves. But since Lori and Melinda were both over the age of 16, 17 years old, they would be qualified for the molestation charges. And these would come because of the sodomy that Shanda had experienced that night. On April 9th, Guy Townsend would issue another charge against the girls. And this charge would be felony murder. And for those of you who don't know, the difference between a murder charge and a felony murder charge. A felony murder charge is when you commit a felony, not necessarily to kill someone, just a felony. And during this committing of a felony, someone dies. Anybody who participates in that felony can get a felony murder charge. The easiest way for me to explain this in a way that would make sense if you aren't familiar with this charge is if you and a group of people decided to rob a bank, and you go into the bank and you are the getaway car and you don't even enter the bank, and somebody goes in the bank to rob the bank and shoots a teller in the head and kills that teller, and they get in your car and you act as the getaway, you can be charged with felony murder because a murder was committed during the felony that you were participating in. I hope that makes sense. You don't actively have to be the person to kill someone in order to get a felony murder charge. On April 17th, Toni Lawrence would be interviewed for a second time by Steve Henry and Buck Shipley, and this time she would be under the presence of her lawyer. She would go on to accept a plea deal on April 22nd, and this deal would eliminate 6 of her 7 charges, and it would only leave the charge of criminal confinement, which was a Class B felony, and it typically had a sentence of 10 years. It could go as high as 20 years, depending on any aggravating circumstances, and it could also go as low as 6 years, depending on the behavior of the person who is being sentenced. On June 5th, a felony murder charge would be filed against Hope Rippy, and on July 13th, Townsend would actually file for both Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett to face the possibility of the death penalty, which was huge because these are just teenagers. I know what they did was horrible, but this made big news that he was going after the death penalty for 2 kids that were still in high school. The reason why he did this was he was wanting them to accept a plea deal, and they weren't. And so he thought maybe he could scare them into accepting a plea deal. Now, in the state of Indiana, in order to be eligible for the death penalty, your murder case has to have aggravating circumstances. And what Townsend had argued the aggravating circumstances in this case was, 1, the girls were lying in wait in order to commit murder on Shanda. And then also they committed arson with the intention of murder. So those were the aggravating circumstances that allowed him to seek the death penalty on these 2 girls. On August 17th, Toni Lawrence would be found unresponsive in her jail cell. And this was because she had been prescribed an antidepressant and she had not been taking them. She had been hoarding them and stockpiling them, and she took them all at once in an attempt to overdose. And she did a pretty good job. In fact, she had to spend a few weeks recovering from her attempt, but she did end up making a recovery and survived her suicide attempt. On September 21st, 1992, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett would sign and accept plea agreements. They would agree to plead guilty to murder, arson, criminal confinement, and the other 7 charges would be dropped. They would also take the death penalty off of the table with this plea agreement. The charges would run concurrently, which meant that they would face a maximum of 30 to 60 years for the most serious charge. The judge officially accepted their plea agreements on October 6th. On December 10th, Toni Lawrence had her guilty plea accepted by Judge Todd in exchange for her testimony at future sentencing trials of Melinda Loveless, Lori Tackett, and Hope Rippy, who is scheduled to have her trial on March 1st, where she was continuing to maintain a not guilty plea. December 14th is when Melinda Loveless's sentencing trial would begin. Prosecutor Townsend would go on an elaborate explanation of the events of the night and the morning of Shanda's murder, painting a picture of the torture and misery that Shanda experienced that night. Toni Lawrence would testify in corroboration of this story, and several witnesses were called in by Townsend to give testimony, despite the fact that there was already a guilty plea. Townsend said that the testimony was part of the circumstances of that case. During the cross-examination of Toni Lawrence, the defense would ask her questions that would be indicative of Lori Tackett being the actual aggressor of the night. Toni Lawrence's testimony, as well as previous polygraph tests, would corroborate that while Melinda was an active participant in the night, most of the ideas that night were initiated by Lori Tackett. Lori Tackett would be called to the witness stand, and though she would give a very similar testimony about the night that Toni Lawrence gave, she would shift the blame off of her and onto Melinda. After about a week's worth of testimony, Judge Todd made his decision as far as sentencing for Melinda, but he sealed that decision and said that it would be released after Lori Tackett's hearing, which would be scheduled for December 28th. Just as she did in Melinda's case, Toni Lawrence also testified in Lori Tackett's trial. Also, Melinda Loveless would testify, and just like Lori did to Melinda, Melinda would testify and try to shift the blame onto Lori. Lori's defense team would go on to show just how many opportunities Melinda had to prevent the murder from happening, but elected not to. They also argued that Melinda pled guilty to murder, but during her testimony was denying involvement, which made it look like her story wasn't straight. Lori Tackett would go on the witness stand to testify on behalf of herself, attempting to gain sympathy by talking about her home life and her mental struggles. The hearings would conclude on December 31st, and the new year would start with the final sentencing of the two girls, which would take place on January 4th, 1993, almost a full year after Shanda's death. The first sentencing would come to Melinda Loveless, and because of the cruel and gruesome nature of the crime, she would be given the maximum of 60 years in prison. Lori Tackett would be next, and like Melinda, because of the cruel and gruesome circumstances of the case, she would also be given 60 years. Now in Indiana, if they have good behavior, they would be eligible for early prison release after 30 years in prison. On January 26, Toni Lawrence would begin her sentencing hearing. Witness testimony would come from Steve Henry as well as Melinda Loveless, and both of them would say that her testimony was absolutely critical in getting a guilty plea out of Melinda and Lori. Steve had talked about Toni's cooperation that she had displayed with him and the people investigating the crime. And Melinda said that, yeah, a big part of the reason why she confessed is because of the story that Toni told, and she knew that she had already been told on. Lori Tackett would also testify, and in Lori's testimony, she would say herself that Toni Lawrence was not very involved in the night other than being there. So since Toni Lawrence had already entered a guilty plea, she was just there for sentencing. And she would be sentenced to the 10 years that the guilty plea would entail. And the judge would also add an additional 10 years for aggravating circumstances, making it a total of a 20-year sentence. Now, she would be eligible for parole after 9 years. The last of the four girls to go through plea agreements and sentencing would be Hope Rippy, who on April 19th would sign a plea agreement in South Bend, Indiana, that was the same as Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett's plea agreements. She would plead guilty to murder, arson, and criminal confinement. Her sentencing hearing would begin on June 1st, where Steve Henry would testify about the statements that Hope had given him. Despite the fact that a psychologist would testify on Hope's behalf that she didn't really understand the events of that night and she was caught up in peer pressure, she would still be sentenced on June 2nd, originally for the maximum of 60 years, but the judge would suspend 10 years for mitigating circumstances, but did say that Hope would serve probation for those 10 years under medium supervision when she was released. On December 14, 2000, Toni Lawrence would be the first of the four girls released, and she would be released after serving 9 years out of her sentence, and it would be followed with 2 years of probation. Hope Rippy would be the next to be released, and that would happen on April 28th, 2006, 14 years into her prison sentence. She would be released, and she would only get 5 out of 10 years of her original probation. The next release is the one that probably makes me the most sick, and it's because of the day that they chose to release her on. Lori Tackett would be released in 2018, but the day she was released was January 11th, 2018, the 26th anniversary of Shanda Sharer's death, and she would be released after serving under 26 years of her 60 years prison sentence. The final girl to be released would be Melinda Loveless, and she would be released on September 5th, 2019, again serving just over 26 years of her 60-year prison sentence. So despite the fact that these 4 girls were all given a pretty hefty original sentence, none of them even came close to serving the full sentence that they were issued. Now, there's a lot of details in this case that I had to bypass in order of keeping it consumable, in order to be able to keep the story condensed down into just 3 episodes. If you want more information on the case, if you want more information as far as like background characters, maybe a little bit more about Amanda Hebron, the book that I read on this case, the book that I lean heavily on is Cruel Sacrifice. And like I said in the first video, it is the first true crime novel that I have ever read, and I've read it more than once. It also has pictures in it. Some of them are graphic, some of them are autopsy pictures of Shanda, and I think I talked about that in the last video. But if you're into that kind of stuff, if you're into reading about true crime, it's very well done, but it does give very graphic descriptions of what Shanda went through that night. So just be warned. It's pretty, this whole case is pretty heavy, but the book is very, very heavy. But now that you know what I know, or at least a lot of what I know, I didn't cut out anything that I considered to be important on the case. But now that you know the case, do you think justice was served? Because I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure. The only one that I have I don't even want to use the word sympathy, because I'm not a perfect person. I don't know if I feel sympathy for any of these girls. What they did was awful. And I like to think that if I was in the situation that Toni Lawrence was in, I would like to think that when I was in the gas station, I would tell somebody, or when I was making phone calls, I would tell somebody. I would like to think that that's what I would do. But I also am trying to tell myself that Toni Lawrence was a 15-year-old kid, and she was probably scared out of her mind. And yeah, she had ample opportunities to stop or to tell somebody about what was going on. She didn't have to rev the engine in case Shanda was screaming in the trunk. I try to be the most understanding of her position. And I accept the fact that her cooperation with the police is what led to the easy guilty charges of the other 3 who were more actively participating in the time. But that's pretty much where my sympathy ends, if she even gets any sympathy from me, because the rest of my sympathy is reserved strictly for Shanda, and my heart breaks for her and for her parents. And yeah, that's where I'm at. I don't believe the other 3 girls got what they deserved. I know they were just kids, but they were kids who did a horrible, horrible thing. and they were old enough to know better. But I look forward to seeing what you have to say about the case. I look forward to hearing, your take in the comments. Also in the comments, let me know if you prefer these longer style videos where I go into more in-depth on cases. I might not do it all the time because this was a lot of work to do this 3-part series. But if it is a case that particularly interests me, and if you guys like the multi-part series, I might look into doing it again in the future. I will link part 1 and part 2 down in the description box down below. And I am going to start working on my next video, but I will warn you, after this case and after the effort that I put into this one and the mental drain that this case does on me, the next one is going to be, I don't want to say more lighthearted because the nature of what we talk about, it's all pretty serious, but it's going to be mentally easier for me. It's likely going to be another one of those 5 pictures video. I know a lot of people actually do like those videos, so that's nice for me that y'all still enjoy that kind of content because it does give me a little bit of a mental break, especially after a case like this. But until then, until that next video drops, like I always say, my friends, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later, all right? Bye.